Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Jim Falk. Today, we're going to be talking about the Arab world, recent events there, and why it matters to all of us. We'll look at President Biden's recent trip to Saudi Arabia, as well as we'll turn to the small country in North Africa, Tunisia, which once sparked hope that democracy would take root across the Arab world. And we'll also discuss the Abraham Accords, which were negotiated during the administration of President Trump, which largely created alliances between Israel and countries that were once its adversaries. And to have our discussion, to join our discussion, we have three experts. First, let me turn to Stephen Cook. Stephen Cook is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and he also writes a regular column for foreign policy. Also with us is Intissar Fakir. She's a senior fellow and director of North Africa and Sahel program at the Middle East Institute, a think tank in Washington, D.C., and she came to the Institute from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Rounding out our panel is Michael Robbins. He is the director and co-principal investigator of what's called the Arab Barometer. This nonpartisan network surveys public opinion across the Arab world. Welcome to all three of you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Stephen, I'd like to turn to you first because you and Ambassador Martin Indyk, who served as U.S. Ambassador to Israel twice, I believe, recently wrote a white paper, a study for the Council on Foreign Relations, recommending that, I think the title of it was The Case for a New U.S.-Saudi Strategic Compact. Just briefly tell us what that is, what you're recommending, and why is it needed?
Well, thanks very much, Jim. And I appreciate you pointing to the Council Special Report on U.S.-Saudi relations. To distill a kind of long piece, we're looking at the U.S.-Saudi relationship which has become quite fraught over actually many years. This is not just a function of the Biden administration. And despite the apparent comedy between the Saudi royal family and the Trump administration, there were problems throughout that administration. And there were problems that preceded that with the Obama administration and even George W. Bush's administration. And with the fraying of this relationship, we thought about a number of different options for U.S. policy. We could allow the relationship to continue as it is, and the two countries continue to move in different directions. We could seek what we call a realist rapprochement, which is to basically sweep the problems between the two countries under the rug and move forward, as we have in the more recent past with kind of verbal security commitments to the Saudis, Saudi commitment to balancing the oil market. Or we could try to strike some new deal between the two countries in which over a period of time, the United States would provide increasingly institutionalized security guarantees. In return, the Saudis would do a number of things, including take public steps towards normalization with Israel, improve its human rights record, get out of Yemen, and make a firm commitment to balance the oil market. Previously in U.S.-Saudi relations, there had been a sort of informal commitment. Oil prices were always going to be at a certain level that didn't hurt the American consumer and allowed the Saudis to do the kind of things they wanted to do domestically, given that 85+% of the Saudi government's budget is based on oil revenues. From time to time, that balance came out of whack. As it is now, yet the Biden administration has been unable to convince the Saudis that putting more oil on the market is in their best interest. So we thought that we offered this idea. It is certainly a tall order. I think we're more likely to find ourselves in a realist rapprochement than actually a strategic compact. But we felt it was important to at least put out the idea of what a kind of new or updated relationship would look like.
So where are we now?
Well, we're definitely not anywhere close to the new strategic compact that Martin and I outlined. As I said, I think we're more likely to end up at the realist rapprochement. The president went to Saudi Arabia. The visit did not go as well as I think people had hoped it might go. The president came back with a number of, I think, modest claims with regard to oil normalization with Israel. but the Saudis really did not give much with regard to Yemen or human rights. And as soon as they made a commitment on pumping more oil, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman essentially walked it back. So it really raises a question why the president went in the first place. It didn't seem like there was a real rationale for it. And he came back actually looking as weak as he did going into the meeting.
You know, I read an interesting article just a few days ago in the Wall Street Journal where it was analyzing and discussing whether or not Saudi Arabia had the ability to really increase its production very much. I mean, here in the United States, we think of Saudi Arabia as having this ability, this capacity, and to be a swing producer. But the article argued that it really isn't as much as we might think.
It's really a matter of debate because it is a tightly held state secret how much oil the Saudis actually have. Mohammed bin Salman said that they could go as high as 13 million barrels a day, but no more. That's different from what Saudi officials had said previously when they planned that they would go to 15 million barrels a day. They have gone as high previously as pumping 12 million barrels a day, but they've only done it for a day or two. So it's very, very unclear what capacity the Saudis have. They certainly don't have the capacity and don't have the inclination to put more oil on the market immediately that might help President Biden with gas prices in the United States. First of all, their amount of oil that the Saudis are producing is subject to agreement within what's called OPEC plus, the OPEC members, plus another 10 oil producers, the most important of which is Russia. And it's the summer in Saudi Arabia, and they use about 1 million of their own barrels to air condition a country that is the size of the United States east of the Mississippi. So whatever agreement, and if you look carefully at what the White House put out, it said that the Saudis made a commitment to pump more oil over a period of time. That's something that OPEC Plus had been planning to do anyway. And as I said, the Crown Prince said, well, it really will have to be a function of market conditions.
Steve, let me interrupt and bring in Intissar, because as you said, why did he go to Saudi Arabia? Well, I don't think he would have gone to Saudi Arabia if there had not been Russia's aggression against Ukraine. And Intissar, you spend so much time in North Africa. You just recently came back from Tunisia. Tell us about how the war is affecting North Africa.
So in a couple of different ways. First is the question of food security. North Africa imports a lot of grain from Russia and Ukraine, and the cost of food, the cost particularly of all wheat and wheat-related products has increased significantly in places like Tunisia, Morocco, pretty much throughout all of North Africa. The other is the cost of oil. The cost of oil has also substantially increased. All of this comes on the heels of all of the supply chain disruptions that the pandemic has brought. And in addition, of course, to increasing inflation, which is making the economic situation in places like Tunisia really particularly difficult for a lot of people.
Give us a sense of the percentage increase. I mean, what is the economic impact, say, of someone who's trying to buy bread for?
So bread is a little bit of a tricky situation because in places like Tunisia, bread is still substantially subsidized. But, for example, in places where bread is not subsidized, you have the cost of baguettes increasing something like 3 or 4 folds. And then it becomes a question of availability. Can you get subsidized bread, or do you have to go to places that are not subsidized and buy and basically buy more expensive bread?
So as I mentioned, Tunisia was once viewed as this example that would bring democracy across so many countries, the so-called Arab Spring, and we know that didn't happen. But in Tunisia, the president, who's a law professor, and he basically started ruling by decree a year ago. And now there is this constitutional referendum that is about to take place. What's the status of that?
So the referendum is going to be voted on Monday. This was an extremely
Let me just set the context so that our viewers will know. That's going to be what, July 25th.
July 25th. So Monday, July 25th, which essentially marks a 1-year anniversary from when Qais Said decided that's the Tunisian president, when he decided to take matters into his own hands. Tunisia was really struggling with a very difficult economic situation that's been going on for pretty much the past 11 years since the revolution. But then the pandemic really just really brought the Tunisian economy and societies to its knees, and it put onto sort of display all of the political challenges that the country has been struggling with, this political morass, division within the political class. And so essentially he comes in July last year, and says, I'm going to take matters into my own hands. I'm going to suspend parliament. I'm going to go ahead and essentially give the executive the ability to rule as they want. And then later on in the fall, he suspends the constitution and starts ruling by decree. And so since basically he did that, what he has essentially been doing right now is promising a kind of transition that's amounted into a new constitution that basically codifies for him the ability to rule by decree. It's a constitution that takes a lot of prerogatives away from the from the parliament. There is the judiciary is effectively all under his control already through various degrees that he has put in place since coming to power. So now we're going to have a Tunisia where basically it's a hyper-presidential system that's been accurately described as a hyper-presidential system, and that's what we'll have moving forward.
So let's ask Michael, do Tunisians care? Do they want democracy?
So this is a really important question. And I think one of the things that we have new survey data out on. So we surveyed Tunisians in October, November of last year. And one of the alarming things we found, to build on Intissar's comment, is even well before the invasion of Ukraine, we saw that a huge number said that they couldn't afford basic necessities like food. So over a clear majority, 57% said they couldn't. So I think this builds on the challenges that we're seeing in Tunisia. In terms of the attitudes towards democracy, it's a kind of interesting finding that we have. So we have seen over time, we've been tracking Tunisia since 2011, and there's been growing concerns about the ability of democracy to deliver the basic needs of people. So the percentage who say that that democracy is not, under a democracy, the economy does not run well, has increased fairly dramatically. So at the time of the revolution, it was only about 17% who held this view, and that's risen up now to close to 2/3, saying that democracy does not function well under, or the economy does not function well under democracy. We've seen the same about trend over questions about democracy and stability and democracy and indecisiveness. And in fact, the weak governments that Tunisia's had prior to, the weak governments they've had since the transition have really been a challenge. Yet at the same time, we see another trend, which I think is quite interesting, which is that Tunisians still say democracy is the best system. And in fact, there isn't a sense of giving up on this system in a way, as Churchill said, it's the worst system except for all the others that have been tried in human history. And I think Tunisians are grasping that this will not solve all their issues. At the same time, they really do seem to support democracy still, the idea of democracy. But of course, one of the major challenges we do see as well is that the events of last July were really endorsed by most of the Tunisian public, at least in the early months. And so we do see a wide support for the changes that Said brought about, the suspension of parliament, the ending of parliamentary immunity. And Said was very popular in Tunisia when we did the survey last October and November. And again, that may have changed. We've seen more challenges. He's not been able to resolve many of those challenges over time. But there is a sense that perhaps this adjustment of the system, that's really significant in Tunisians' mind, shakeup of the system may have actually been a very big positive. And I think the question now is, will that endure? And our sense is that probably it will go down over time as things do not change. But there was a sense that the transition to democracy, or the democratic transition, needed some type of reinvigoration, if you will. And I think that gave them hope.
Michael, let me ask you about Egypt, a country that Steve Cook knows very well.
Sure. So in Egypt is a country that we've seen significant challenges in. It's actually very hard at this point to do surveys in Egypt, unfortunately. We do, again, see kind of some of the same trends. In Egypt, actually, there's a huge sense of of hunger, as I said, that it's actually the country that we find across the 10 countries we surveyed where most people are going hungry at this point. At the same time, we can't, or say they can't afford basic necessities like food at least a few times during the past year. So it is really alarming to see these numbers. At the same time, we do see somewhat similar trends. Egyptians still say they want democracy. They still want these elements, but again, they haven't had this for some time. And we have tracked this in the past. And one of the issues, as we had seen before, is that Egyptians really felt like they'd never had this transition to democracy in quite the same way. That I think in Tunisia, it was quite open. They saw the challenges. In Egypt, we saw somewhat different as the old regime and as certainly the Muslim Brotherhood were competing for elections for power. Egyptians had a somewhat different relationship there with democracy.
Steve, what do you have to say about this?
Well, look, I think on the current economic problems that Egyptians are facing is really not a surprise, but it's quite worrying. Not only Egypt even going into the current, kind of global economic challenges with, significant numbers of people living on less than $2 a day, a profoundly poor country. The country is also public indebtedness is unprecedented. So all of Egypt, much of what Egypt is doing is just debt servicing and renegotiating with the IMF in order to service significant debt. This is something that it can lead to economic collapse. And of course, Egypt is an enormous country. Add to that the fact that the government has ruled almost exclusively via coercion, which is expensive and dangerous. I'm not suggesting that Egypt is on the lip of yet another uprising. No one predicted what happened in January 25th, 2011. But the situation in Egypt is rather tenuous. And it's something that has really kind of fallen off the radar screens of policymakers and others, because there's a sense that Abdel Fattah Sisi has kind of consolidated his power, however terrible that may be, by means of massive amounts of force used against the population. However, he is essentially at this point ruling because there is no alternative to him. There's sort of a passive acceptance among the population that he's there, and among the power centers within Egypt, there's a passive acceptance that if not Sisi, well, then who? So Egypt is something that is fairly high on my worry list. But there's unfortunately not all that much the international community can do other than through the IMF continue to help Egypt service its debt and efforts to open up the ports in Ukraine to get grain out of that country. Egypt is the largest importer of grain in the world.
Well, we just have a few minutes left, and I promised our viewers that we would talk a bit about the Abraham Accords. And Tunisia is not a party of that. Why isn't Tunisia? Just give me a quick answer on that, if you could, and then I want to move back to Michael.
Well, I think Tunisia has a long history in terms of relationship with the Palestinians and the Palestinian Authority. So that's a little bit of a harder sort of starting point. There is also the current president who's made it very clear that he would not be interested in any kind of normalization deal with Israel.
Michael, your studies on how different Arab countries view the Abraham Accords is fascinating. Tell us about it.
So we've asked a number of questions about relationship with Israel over the years. And recently in the last wave, which we did in 2021 through 2022, we asked this again. And one of the things that we found is in two of the countries that we have had normalization agreements with Israel, we actually find support being the highest. The highest is in Sudan at 39% of the population. And in Morocco, it's a bit lower, but still that is widely supported. These two stand out. And again, I think there is an important issue here, which is that these are two countries that received a major benefit from this, particularly from the U.S. In the case of Sudan being, removed from the list of state sponsors of terrorism, which opens up a lot more options financially, and in Morocco, the recognition by the United States of Western Sahara simultaneous to the agreement being announced. And so, in both cases, the population, particularly the educated population, those who have higher levels of education in both countries, seem to understand the trade-offs. That there was a major benefit, and there seems to be support for this. At the same time, elsewhere in the region, we see very low support. That typically in countries, about 1 in 10 or fewer say that they actually support these accords. What's notable about that is that in Egypt and Jordan, of the countries we surveyed, this is the lowest. And these are two countries with long-standing peace agreements with Israel that since since the 70s and 90s. And so it is something that, as this goes on, is potentially there is a longer engagement with Israel. This doesn't necessarily mean that these numbers will hold. Our sense is that as some of the initial benefits of these deals proceed in people's minds, that these may come down as well. But it is something that we do see a fair amount of variation.
So it all sounds very complex and uncertain. Steve, what's it mean to the United States?
The Abraham Accords. Well, look, it's a long time goal of the United States to broaden what peace processors call the circle of peace around Israel. And certainly the Abraham Accords have been an accomplishment. Government-to-government relations are obviously much better among different governments of the region. Israel and the UAE in particular have been looking for ways to normalize for years, even before the signing of the Abraham Accords. But as Michael's surveys demonstrate and other surveys of the region demonstrate, there's a huge disconnect between these governments and what populations support. That may change. There is some pressure that the Abraham Accords has put on governments seeking economic opportunity with Israel. Suddenly, after 40 years, you can actually fly between Cairo and Tel Aviv pretty regularly. The Egyptians have stepped up their desires and meetings in terms of deepening economic ties with Israel.
Steve, let me jump in. I hear what you're saying and how that's going to make a difference there, but how does it impact our viewer in Dallas, Texas?
Well, I think from the perspective of your average American, where there is a general sense that Israel is an ally of the United States, this is better for Israel. It also puts Israel in a better strategic position so that kind of annual fights in Congress and American taxpayer dollars don't necessarily have to go to supporting Israeli security. It does, to some extent, reduce tension in the region that may, in fact, help the United States focus its efforts elsewhere, other priorities in the world, whether it's war in Europe, challenges in Asia, challenges south of our border, which are numerous, that have gone neglected because there's been so much focus on the Middle East, in particular our relationship with Israel and trying to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict.
So as we begin to close the program, let me ask you this, each of you. Intissar, what gives you hope and what are you most worried about?
When I look at North Africa, I think the one thing that really gives me hope is just the sense that young people across North Africa have in terms of what they deserve from their governments and what they want from their governments. They really have high aspirations for a more free, a more just, and a more secure future. And I very much hope that they would be successful in holding their ruling powers accountable so that they can give them this. So that's the one thing that gives me hope as I look at this turbulent region.
And on the other side, what worries you?
What worries me is the extent to which these governments don't seem to be listening and don't seem to be willing to actually heed what their people are saying. So that's a big disconnect.
Steve?
Well, I admire Intissar for having some hope somewhere. I'm old enough and spent enough time in this region that I'm deeply cynical about the future of the region, precisely for the reason that she pointed out that keeps her up at night, which is that the governments remain isolated from their own people, remain unresponsive to their own people. And as a result, people suffer because the way in which they establish political control is not through establishing a kind of loyalty, a positive vision for the future, but through coercive measures. And that it produces lots of suffering, lots of instability, and lots of people who are seeking to leave the region as a result.
And Michael, you have a pulse on these countries?
I do. I think that there's a lot of concern. I mean, certainly the rates of hunger, the rates of frustration of the economy, they're higher than we've ever seen. Even at the time of the Arab uprisings, these are higher than we've seen in the past. And so there is a lot of worry we have. The degree to which civil liberties are protected in the minds of people is, people say that they're lower than they've ever been. Even after the Arab uprisings, we saw them increase, and now they've fallen back. So there's a lot to worry about. And again, the disconnect between governments and the people is massive. At the same time, we do see a sense that people want change. That I think, as Intissar was saying, that there is a hope that people think that there is a way for potentially better governance. People are still more committed to democracy in a sense, recognizing the challenges. I think if there were, again, I think as Steve said, it doesn't make a lot of sense to predict future uprisings or future changes of power, given the long history of the region. But if there were to be that, I think that we might see a more realistic sense of what democracy can deliver and a belief that this would work. So I think there is some hope that if there's an opening, that democracy might actually have a chance with the views of the people.
And Steve, that gets us back to where we started in the program. It is so hard for the U.S. to step away and pivot away from the Middle East, isn't it?
It is indeed extremely difficult. And going back to Saudi Arabia, until the United States, pursues a rational energy policy, gets serious about it, we will remain deeply involved with the Saudis and complicit with the Saudis. We need to fundamentally rethink our own domestic politics and our approaches to these issues if we want to rethink our Middle East policy.
And I guess when you look at that right now, there really doesn't seem to be a whole lot of appetite for it, is there?
No, in fact, that's one of the reasons why President Biden went to Saudi Arabia, rather than having to fight over having a rational energy policy. It was just easier to go to Saudi Arabia and ask Mohammed bin Salman to pump more oil. It's too difficult domestically to talk about the kinds of massive investments we need to make in alternative energy to mitigate our dependence on oil from that part of the world and our codependency with Saudi Arabia.
Well, I want to thank all three of you for bringing different perspectives on such an important topic. And I know it's one that our viewers are concerned about and need to be. So thank you for spending part of your day with us. And thank you, all of you, for watching our program today. And as always, we bring you different perspectives on things that matter with people who care.